Rather, the intelligence center of the cell is the membrane. The membrane receives signals from our consciousness and writes the DNA code. For the first time in history, Dr. Bruce Lipton is proving that we can actually reprogram our DNA if we are dissatisfied with our blueprint, and broadcast a new message about ourselves to the universe.
The fact is that the cell membrane of the human cell actually is an information processor. And what I ultimately realized in 1985 was that that processor had a very interesting and important definition. The definition of the membrane is it's a liquid crystal semiconductor with gates and channels. When I recognized this biochemical description in 1985, I was very much amused by it because I said I've heard that exact same definition somewhere else and actually had to go search for where I heard it or found it. And what I saw was I read it in a book called Understanding Your Microprocessor, a simpleton book about how to use a computer. Basically, the definition, liquid crystal semiconductor with gates and channels, is the exact same definition of a computer chip. What this all led to was a very simple and yet very profound understanding. The cell is an information processor because the membrane reads the environment and adjusts the biology. The nucleus of the cell with its genes represents a hard disk, and the genes are programs. Our old belief system is that the nucleus and its programs were read-only memory, so that whatever the genes are, that would be our fate. However, the new insights offered revealed that the nucleus of the cell was not read-only, it was actually read-write. So basically, the cell was a programmable device. You'd put it into an environment, it would read the environment, and then adjust the expression of the genes to match the needs of that environment. So taking genetically identical cells and putting one set into a culture with certain environmental conditions caused the cell to program itself as a muscle cell, and a genetically identical cell put in yet another environment, reading the constituents of that environment would lead to the expression of a bone cell. So basically, the cells are programmable in response to environmental information. And one last piece just to tie it together for all of us to understand is that if you put a culture dish of cells into an adverse environment, then what would happen is that those cells would actually get sick and start to die. And if you take that very same culture dish and move it into a healthy environment, the same cells would immediately recover and start to proliferate, and the cultures will flourish. The relevance about all this is that we go back to the nature of a human being and recognize that containing 50 trillion cells, the human body is essentially a skin-covered petri dish. If you take your human petri dish body and put it into an adverse environment, it will cause the cells to get sick and to actually begin to die. And yet if you take that same skin-covered body and put it into a healthy environment, the cells will rapidly recover and begin to flourish again. So the important reality is that our state of health or disease is really a reflection of the environment that we live in and the environment that we perceive.
Like, don't trust me. He goes, I will torment you. And I swear to God, that's what ended up happening. I've been tormented by this relationship.
In each one of us, there are 46 human chromosomes, among which there are nearly 3 billion base pairs of DNA. That means there are 3 billion strands inside of us to store our personal information. If we can rewrite our own hard drive by reorganizing our thoughts, feelings, and higher consciousness, we can reprogram our own personal blueprint to attain any goal we desire. As our personal energy signature broadcasts this new message, we will discover new people in our coincidence meetings. We will also gain new knowledge to apply towards our own enlightenment, relationships, careers, and life purpose. Scientific studies have shown The heart is not only the most powerful center in the body, it is the most intelligent, having the ability to receive precognition. If we can create a coherence with our minds and heart center, we can access our intuition more frequently.
One of the interesting studies that was done here at the Institute of Heart Math with our chief researcher, Dr. Roland McCready, was a study on intuition, on the intuitive response. And in that study, they had test subjects that were placed in front of a computer, and they were wired up. They were looking at brain waves, they were looking at galvanic skin response, they were looking at readings from the heart rate variability analysis, and things like that. The test subject would push a button, and there would be a delay before the picture would appear on the screen of the computer. And the computer was randomly selecting the pictures. No one could know what the computer was going to select. Some of the pictures were pleasant, and some were horrific. What we found was that in many cases, the body started responding to the upcoming picture, responding in the way it would normally to the upcoming picture, about 6 seconds prior to the picture actually showing up on the screen. 6 seconds prior, the body began to do what it would do if the picture was there. It was a very, very complicated study, a very detailed study, published in 2 parts in the Journal of Complementary and Alternative Medicine. The data analysis showed something very, very interesting. It showed that when that response began, that the first part of our physiology that was doing sort of the intuitive or precognitive response was actually the heart. The heart was responding before the brain. It began to go through a deceleration process that would be compatible with the picture that was going to come up. About a second and a half later, the brain began to do what it does in regards to that picture. But within the human system, at the physiological level, measuring that intuitive response to an upcoming event, it was the heart that responded first. And as I read the summary of that study, I found it fascinating, because what the summary basically said was that it appears as if an upcoming event is significant or emotional, that we have a tendency to be able to sense that or to respond to it before it actually occurs. And that our biology has the capacity and does in many ways scan for the future events. It's constantly scanning for future events, but that it's something we're not aware of. We don't know that it's there. We don't know that we do it. But the punchline was it would be very useful for us to develop that. And it has a lot of utility, a lot of practicality in how we navigate our lives. And so it's just one study beginning to decode, something that's remained sort of mystical or sort of vague, which is intuition. What is intuition? And I think certainly there's a lot more to go in that area, but this is one study that indicates that there is a response, that the body itself is actually scanning for future events, and that the first responder to that entire process is not the brain, but in fact it is the heart.
We know that our whole biosystem begins to shift in terms of what we in sports psychology have been referring to as being in our zone. So when a person learns to open into that more quantum attuned way of being aware and being present, it's like instead of focusing in narrow band, problem focused, fear-based ways, where we're looking at some kind of threat and focused entirely on a problem, and all our internal organs begin to contract, and thus our emotional system begins to go into overreaction. When we're feeling and emoting, when we're being within that zone space, our internal organs begin to open up. They begin to relax. Our awareness field, instead of being narrowband focused, starts to broadband focus. And what studies have shown is that in that state, we actually begin to process way more bits of information per moment. And when we're in that state, we have the experience as though time is slowing down. Because we know from time and motion studies in movie projection that when we feed more frames of information per moment through a projector, it creates the illusion of time slowing down. So this is often what people experience when they're in that zone state of more quantum field, present attuned awareness. They start to feel like they can make much more effective decisions in a kind of ongoing, flow-like way. We've all had tastes of what it's like to be in this zone. Those are those magical times when you have a few hours, a few days sometimes, even sometimes a few weeks, where it seems like you just can't do anything wrong. Everything comes up roses. You're in the right place at the right time, the right information comes to you, you start to feel like you're being guided to make the right decision. So this is part of what we're talking about in terms of becoming more quantum level attuned.
In 1992, Professor Walter Schempp discovered how atoms communicate with each other over any distance through the field. He discovered in the atom, when electrons are in a higher frequency shell or orbit around the proton, the atom emits light waves carrying intelligent information, similar to the way when we are talking and communicating, our brain waves go into a higher frequency wave state. He found when the electron jumps to a lower frequency wavelength, the atom receives photons carrying intelligent information as if they are listening, just as when we are listening, we go into a lower frequency brainwave state. The timing of when electrons jump shells to higher or lower frequency orbits is completely random and cannot be quantified by any mathematical predictable formula likened to random human behavior. There are several other behaviors in quantum mechanics that remind physicists of human random consciousness, as opposed to models demonstrating repeatable and reliable mathematical timing, such as the sun rising every day at the precise expected time, and the 9 planets' orbits around it. In the quantum universe, finding precise timing and repetition of events is very difficult in certain functions of the atom and its components. Niels Bohr and Heisenberg presented to Einstein at the 1927 Fifth Solvay Conference on Quantum Mechanics that the minds of the researchers were affecting the angular momentum of the electron spin around the proton. This was because different data came in when different researchers were conducting the experiments. The data was always random and could not be quantified in a repeatable and reliable mathematical formula. As far as the laws of mathematics refer to reality, they are not certain. And as far as they are certain, they do not refer to reality. Albert Einstein. In Richard Feynman's book, The Strange Theory of Light and Matter, he tried to quantify the behavior of the timing of which light particles, photons, emanating from a light source would reflect through several layers of glass and bounce back to detectors. Light particles do 3 things when they strike a glass target. 1, they either travel through the glass sheet, or 2, they react and scatter inside the glass sheet, or 3, they bounce back to give us a picture of the sheet of glass. Feynman shined his light source through several sheets of glass, allowing light particles to choose to bounce off of or react to the surface of various layers of glass. He wanted to see if there was a quantifiable formula for which photons would bounce back and which ones would travel through the glass or penetrate deeper and bounce off another sheet of glass, or scatter and react inside of it, or deeper yet, travel through all the sheets of glass. Regardless of the color of light and various other parameters, there was no way to quantify the strange behavior of light and matter. The light particles, photons, always behaved randomly as to what they would choose to do, just as in human consciousness. Could human intention be so powerful that it could tell particles of light, photons, to penetrate through several layers of glass and even solid barriers? PhD psychologist Stanislav Ojak has demonstrated his power of intention over the film plane of a camera. His intention is so powerful, he found he can cause a photograph to appear while the lens cap on the camera is blocking the lens and the film plane from receiving light. He has done this hundreds of times. He has also been able to take pictures with film and cause invisible spiritual phenomena to appear. His film and photographs were analyzed by Kodak Film Laboratories to be authentic and not caused by double exposures or trick photography.
Several abnormalities that began to occur in the photographs. People became transparent or they disappeared, light aberrations, and then entities which appear to be human-like in some form, but not as we would say it was definitely humanoid. And these aberrations went on. So over a period of about 4 years, it's 74 to, it's longer than that. 74 to 1981, accumulated over 5,000 photographs with a 22% anomalous factor in regards to that.
As Stanislav Jack took mystical photographs of the 1972 Seals and Crofts concert, a large luminous face appears overlooking the band on stage with Cher. Then what appeared to be a band of divine beings of light, pointing and perhaps even dancing to their music, gazed into our world without us ever even knowing it. Could beings of light and even angels have listened to the spiritual music of Seals, Croft, and Cher? Could such beings have even inspired their music to be born?
He took pictures with the lens cap on the camera, so that the radiations that eventually were registered on the film went right through the lens cap. And the lens cap will block electromagnetic radiations. So it definitely was different radiations than electromagnetism. And that's why I've called these things subtle energies. Doesn't mean they're weak. It means they're subtle in the sense that they're very different from the energies associated with the four fundamental forces that we know from orthodox science.
Dr. Claude Swanson's synchronized universe model may help explain how we can see into the invisible dimensions of the universe and explain visions and apparitions, and how we can interact with those dimensions, but more importantly, to prove that they are part of our reality.
I developed what I call the synchronized universe model as a way of trying to expand current physics to account for a lot of these psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena. Besides the types of things we've been talking about, which involve communication psychically and affecting things at a distance, you also have other abilities that the yogis have demonstrated, that certain adepts in China, the Qigong masters, have demonstrated, things like walking through walls, levitation, teleportation, things that in the West we'd laugh at and we call them science fiction, and yet there are people who have demonstrated reliable abilities to produce these effects. So our science needs to be able to account for how this is possible. And the synchronized universe model says basically that matter is not what we thought it was. They're not like little billiard balls or even little quantum points moving around, that when we say there's a particle at some place, it's a solid matter, what that really involves is an energy exchange between that charge or that particle and all the other particles in the universe. That things are moving very rapidly on a very small scale. This is a scale smaller than the size of the electron, down to more like the Planck scale, which is the basic smallest scale that physics tries to describe. At that scale, there's a synchronization that has to happen, that particles only see each other when their velocities are lined up with each other. In other words, at a very small scale, all the particles are moving very rapidly at the speed of light. So in this system, at a very small scale, and this is part of what we have special relativity, part of our current physics, at very high speeds, a particle only can kind of look in the direction that it's traveling. So if it emits a photon It has to be in the direction that it's traveling at that instant. Off in the distance would be some other particle. If they're going to interact mutually back and forth, that particle also has to have a velocity lined up with the first one. So the primary interactions at this very small scale would involve particles with velocities that are aligned at that moment of interaction. A moment later, their velocities have changed because they received an impulse from one another. And what this leads to is the only stable solution of this system is when the particles end up being synchronized with each other. The ones that interact consistently on the average over time are the ones that take on little orbits at very small scale, down to Planck level, which are synchronized. You could have many, many other systems of particles that have some other synchronization, either a different frequency of oscillation or a different phase, so they're in some other part of their orbit. They're looking in a different direction. Those particles would not, on the average, see the first set of particles. So they would be invisible to us, or we might see them occasionally as quantum noise, and that may well be the origin of quantum noise. So you end up with a system which you could think of like a stack of sheets of paper, and one sheet of paper is like our physical universe. The particles on that sheet of paper are the ones that are synchronized with each other. We call that physical reality. That's what our current physics tries to explain. That's where our laws are applicable. But you could have many, many other sheets of paper with these other parallel systems that are synchronized a little bit differently. Now, what raising the gauge and paranormal phenomena and torsion, these other forces that I've been talking about, what they do is they shift our little sheet of paper. So now we start to move down and dip down and interact with other parallel systems. And that's what happens when you can start now to, instead of being limited to a four-dimensional reality, your dimensionality now can be 5, 6, or 7 dimensions as you interact with other parallel systems. When that happens, strange things become possible that were not possible before.
According to the synchronized universe model, when our own frequency synchronizes with the parallel universe or dimension, it allows us to perceive it in the form of a vision, powers of levitation, miracles, knowledge, enlightenment, and even healing. Our bodies are made of atoms and subatomic particles. 99.9% of our body weight is comprised of protons and neutrons, which are then made of hexagons of 6 quarks, each made of dual pairs. Among the quarks are the mysterious strange and anti-strange quark. They are called strange because they have the ability to randomly just disappear from the core of the atom and then strangely reappear. There is no mathematical model to quantify the timing of when and why they will do this. Is there a connection to the behavior of the strange quark in human consciousness? Knowing that we are also made of a significant percentage of strange quarks, that portion of us is dematerializing and rematerializing at random all of the time. No one has been able to determine where the strange quarks travel to, other than the fact that they disappear into other dimensions and reappear. Do they travel to other dimensions to gain information or to communicate at a distance? This behavior demonstrates that part of our consciousness does travel into other dimensions. Can this help explain communication at a distance and mental telepathy? In the 1970s, President Carter, the CIA, and the Air Force used 2 psychics trained in remote viewing to locate a lost Russian Tu-22 bomber, which no other forces could find. The remote viewers gave blind latitude-longitude coordinates that led Air Force officials to point their satellite cameras deep into the jungles of Africa, precisely where the Russian Tu-22 had crashed.
The significance of the case where Carter talks about how remote viewers were used to find the missing bomber that had gone down in the jungle shows that remote viewing can be very accurate and can be useful. Now his comments about the case were a little bit of an oversimplification. There was more than one remote viewer actually involved. They do it several times to check one another. But the fact is that remote viewing, number one, can be very accurate, and number two, was really used for important cases over an extended period of time. And even though they claim that it's finished and there's no more remote viewing going on, that's what they said before they admitted that this program was there too. So you can make your own conclusions about that. The point is that consciousness really can be used to give us information that might otherwise be unobtainable.
Later, in 1979, Congressman Charles Rose, then chairman of the House Subcommittee on Intelligence Evaluation, reviewed the U.S. government's secret psychic spy program. He then warned that if the Russians had this ability and we didn't pursue it further, we would be in serious trouble.
Well, there's certainly plenty of evidence that the out-of-body programs were going on, the remote viewing programs were going on. What has been made public is the 20-year remote viewing program that was started by the CIA in the 70s that physicist Hal Puthoff and a couple other people started. And they found out from their early experiments they could go into laboratories in Russia. One of the first laboratories was at Semipalatinsk, which the CIA at that time had been unable to look into. They saw a building, large structures, a lot of activity, but they could not tell what it was being used for. And so one of the first successes that started the program was when a man named Pat Price remote viewed the inside of the facility. He saw overhead cranes. He saw overhead cranes moving along overhead outside of the building that had railroad tracks on each side of the building. He saw these huge steel spheres that were being cut with special types of welding techniques. They were foot-thick steel sections of spheres. We had no way of, at that time, of welding such large structures, but they developed a technique to do so. And by using his remote viewing ability, he figured out that these were going to become large underground spheres to capture the energy from explosions and then use that energy to make a beam weapon. This was part of the Russian beam weapon program. And of course, in the 80s, Ronald Reagan started the Star Wars program in an effort to counteract some of this technology. But the first inkling we had that the Russians were involved in this was Pat Price's remote viewing back in 1974 or 75.
While the United States nuclear weapons program, Heat and Evolution, was a 15-megaton nuclear bomb, the Russians were far superior, testing a 50-megaton hydrogen bomb on October 30th, 1961. Was Russian psychic espionage into the United States secret weapons program instrumental in allowing them to gain the advantage? Today, with the Cold War at its end, Russian psychic research is used for mostly peaceful means. Konstantin Korotkov is a professor of physics at St. Petersburg Tech University in Russia. He is the inventor of the world's first camera that can see deep into the human aura's energy field and information band. It is called the GDV. The computer software reads the data the GDV provides on an individual's auric field. It can see breaks in the energy field, early signs of damage to organs, and changes in the field due to higher states of consciousness, the amplitude of energy coming out of all 7 energy centers, how well the 7 energy centers communicate with each other, and even mental telepathy and healing.
So it was really very interesting time because we were able to organize a research laboratory, a research center outside of the city in some remote place. We took a house. In this house we put all possible equipment that we were able to think of by that time. And we've been selecting and inviting people who was really talented clairvoyants and talented psychic people. And then we trained them how to operate with each other, how to deal with telepathic communications, and we've been measuring all this process. So it was many sessions like this, several years. It was very interesting results, and everything we published secret reports on this, of course. It never been published in any journal, but we have proven that telepathic communication with people is really possible. And it was done on very precise scientific basis. But our approach was different from approach of Russell Targ or some other researchers in the world. First step was to select specific people, to find out people who can do something and who communicate with each other. And I am absolutely sure that really effective communication comes between people who are really attuned to each other, who have this very, very special entanglement to each other. It may be men, women, it may be men, it may be women, women, it doesn't matter. It's not a gender difference. It is a topic of, I would say, spiritual interconnection. And if they have it, then they may be trained how to interact with each other. So from our point of view, when we've done this experiment, and we are doing these experiments up till now, it is very important to select people, to train them and attune to each other. Then it may be effective communication.
Do we receive messages from others without even knowing it?
This was a study to show, is it possible to send and quantify, measure energy of healing, loving energy, through sending. So if we send loving energy to another being who is not directly in front of you, but in another space, will they receive it? And if they receive it, how does it show? Wow. That was the purpose. And this was done with a team of researchers in Slovenia. So here we see that you've got the person who is sending energy. This is the right side, is sending of energy. And on this side is the receiving of energy. So from the right side, when you talk about, because the emotional heart is on the right, it is sending, so there is a little burst, and of course these bursts are captured.
And it's separate from the body. It's leaving, this burst is leaving the body.
Indeed.
Oh, that's amazing.
And the receiver is receiving it. And look at the shape of that too.
How far away are they physically from each other during the
experiment?
2 buildings.
2 buildings.
So this burst of energy traveled 2 buildings and went to
this person who was the receiver.
And this is documented scientifically as biophoton emissions.
Yes, yes.
If we attempt to send someone we are tuned into a message with our mind, will they hear it? Will they receive it?
Protocol where we have instruments on both people, both sender and receiver, and they physically situated in different places, and it may be in different places in Moscow and St. Petersburg, or Moscow to St. Petersburg, or Himalaya to Moscow, Nepal to Moscow, Venezuela to Moscow. So we did a lot of experiments of this kind. In any situation we have time that is correlated to astronomical time, and it's all now possible by GPS to correlate all this. And we were able, and we are measuring moment of sending emotion, because we are sending not images, not some pictures, not letters, but we are sending emotions. and they aim to detect those emotions on the other end. So we are measuring sending and response from biophysical measurements. This is electroencephalography, electrophotonics, and balancing platform. So we can really detect the moments of sending and receiving. And in all our experiments, we demonstrate that it is no time shift.
Not zero.
Zero.
Instantaneous action at a distance.
Absolutely. Instantaneous effect.
As new science builds a strong case for mental telepathy that is faster than the speed of light, how will this instantaneous communication at a distance change our views and knowledge about how powerful each and every one of us really is?
That after all our experiments on telepathy, it became clear that in principle you can contact any person in the world. If you can attune yourself to this particular person. And of course it needs some training, it needs some imagination, you should be trained how to do this, but in principle it's not very difficult. And I don't like, for example, to make telephone calls. For me it's boring to press buttons and it's busy line, then again, and it's again busy. So when I need to contact someone, I just contact this person in mindset, and they ask person to call me. And it works very well. So it's people usually call and contact somehow, and it works really brilliant.
Could a telepathic message be sent from the moon back to Earth? In 1971, Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Mitchell believed the powers of the human aura and mental telepathy were so profound he conducted an experiment while he was on his way back to Earth from the moon.
Astronaut Edgar Mitchell, one of our team of 2 astronauts who were the last group, I think, to walk on the moon. This was the 3rd group to walk on the moon. On his way back, decided to do a psychic communication experiment. He didn't tell his superiors about it, but he'd arranged with several psychics on the ground back here on Earth to try to send them psychic messages about cards. There's a set of cards called the Zener cards, which have patterns on them, and during several intervals on the way back from the moon, he was 200,000 miles or more from the Earth at some of those times, he would send these signals back to psychics on the Earth. When he got back, he compared what he was sending with what they picked up, and the answers that they had received were accurate enough. They were well above chance, and they were showing that ESP was working even over those large distances. So at our present time, it appears as though that we don't know of any limits in terms of distance or time for psychic communication.
Subtle energies all go faster than light. Now, I'll ask you to visualize a reaction equation, as if you've got a blackboard in front of you, and I'll write mass with arrows back and forth to energy. That is basically what we've done for the last 400 years in orthodox science. And the connection link is Einstein's E equals mc squared. Well, now we want to expand traditional science to include human consciousness. Our experiments show that works now in this world we live in. But we don't all agree what consciousness is. So let's not ask what consciousness is. Let's ask what consciousness does.